Now, here's Saul Eslake, independent economist, and his business is called Corinna Economic Advisory. Saul, a couple of recent things to talk about. The consumer sentiment yesterday, another fall down to basically the levels we saw at the depths of the GFC. So what does that tell you? What do you learn from that?
Well, at first blush, the most plausible answer is the most obvious one, that consumers are alarmed at the combination of rising cost of living, especially for essential everyday items, and with higher interest rates, although it's interesting that consumer sentiment appears to have deteriorated as much among people who rent their homes or who own their homes outright as among people who have mortgages to service, even though the first two groups aren't directly affected by higher interest rates. So there's obviously a range of concerns there in front of households. So far, however, that doesn't seem to have translated into significant slowing in consumer spending. Consumer sentiment peaked last December and has fallen every month since then, but consumer spending on discretionary items, at least through June, that is incorporating the first two increases in interest rates, has still held up remarkably well. And as we also learnt yesterday, business confidence actually improved in July and business conditions remain remarkably favourable.
Yeah, so what do you think's going on? I mean, obviously the Reserve Bank changed its inflation forecast on Friday, I think, to 7.75% for the December quarter. So I guess that tells you it's going to keep raising interest rates, doesn't it?
Yes, although the Reserve Bank says it's not on any preset path with regard to interest rates, it seems to me fairly clear that they intend to get the cash rate up to somewhere around what they regard as neutral. And although they haven't spelled out what they think neutral is.
What do you think it is?
Well, I think it's around 2.5%, using the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's target range for inflation, which is 2.5%, as a measure of inflation over the longer term, which it has been over the period since the Reserve Bank gained its independence from the government and formally started targeting inflation. That would imply a real cash rate of zero, bearing in mind, of course, nobody actually pays the cash rate. That would be consistent with a mortgage rate, a standard variable mortgage rate of just under 7%. And that, I think, represents a real interest rate that's consistent with historic norms. Perhaps one of the explanations for the discrepancy between the big fall in consumer sentiment and the fact that the economy appears still to be ticking along at a reasonable pace, including as a result of strong growth in consumer spending on discretionary items, is that although interest rates have risen very quickly over the last 4 months, they are still very low by historical standards. I mean, at 1.85%, even at 2.5%, the cash rate is and would be lower than the level to which it fell during the global financial crisis of 3%, which the governor of the Reserve Bank at the time described as an emergency level. In other words, there's still quite a lot of stimulus sloshing around in the system, and the Reserve Bank probably recognises, somewhat belatedly, that it needs to get monetary policy settings more in line for an economy which is at full employment, that is, with the unemployment rate at 3.5%, the lowest since 1974, and with inflation running significantly above the Reserve Bank's target band, not just over the next 6 months, but on the forecast they released on Friday, will not have returned to the upper end of the target band until the end of 2024.
So presumably, if they're forecasting 7.75% inflation, they want to bring about a significant slowdown in the economy, right?
Yes, and based on their forecast, the economy is going to slow to a growth rate of less than 2% in 2023 and 2024, which I think is right. And probably the unemployment rate may drift up by more than they forecast, to 4% by the end of 2024, especially if immigration to Australia picks up in line with the assumptions that both the government and implicitly the Reserve Bank are making about Australia's migration intake. I think if growth does slow to less than 2%, the unemployment rate will probably rise by more than 0.5 percentage point over that period. I think inflation will slow over the course, or will decline over the course of 2023 2023 and into 2024. And we can already see some signs globally that many of the factors which sparked this initial rise in inflation just over a year ago are now starting to turn around. Apart from natural gas, most commodity prices are now falling. There is growing evidence that the supply chain difficulties that were another important source of inflation globally in Australia are now slowly beginning to resolve themselves. And of course, as more aggressive increases in interest rates in other major economies start to slow them down, as they will. And for example, we saw last week the Bank of England explicitly forecasting a 5-quarter long recession in the UK beginning in the December quarter of this year. As demand slows globally, I think some of the global forces that are part of the inflation story in Australia will also start to abate. And that will help inflation come down in Australia, even if the Reserve Bank doesn't do any more. The Reserve Bank will, of course, be doing some more over the balance of this year. So that, I think, does mean both that inflation will come down and that growth in the Australian economy will slow.
Right, but you're not forecasting a recession. You think it's more likely to be a soft landing?
At this stage, I think that's more likely than an outright recession. Obviously, the chance of Australia experiencing a recession is not zero. At the moment, I would put that as perhaps somewhere near 1 in 4. And if we do experience a recession, then international factors will play a major role in bringing it about. That is to say, the risk of recession in Europe is probably at least 50-50, if not higher. The risk of a recession in the US is, I think, clearly more than 1 in 3 and might be getting close to 50-50.
Just on the US, if I can interrupt, I find it interesting that they've had two consecutive quarters of negative GDP, but they're still arguing about whether there's a recession. In fact, they don't.
Well, yes,
I don't think there has been a recession. Or is a recession?
As I've said to you before, I don't buy the so-called technical recession definition of consecutive quarters in a row of negative GDP growth. And to give you two examples, the US did have a recession in 2001 in the aftermath of the tech wreck and the September 11 terrorist attacks, but there were in fact 3 quarters in a row of negative growth during that. There were 3 quarters of negative growth during that period, but none of them consecutive. Nobody in Australia talks about the recession of 1977, even though we had consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth in the second half of 1977. A much more sensible definition of recession, one which doesn't give any false signals, as the consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth does, one which works in developing countries as well as advanced economies, and one which makes much more sense to people who aren't economists, is when the unemployment rate rises by 1.5 percentage points or more in 12 months or less. Now, that's something I think could well happen in the United States over the next 12 to 18 months as the Fed's more aggressive rate rises do start to bite, and as what hasn't been much noticed, but a significant increase in the personal income tax burden in the US also begins to bite. The issue for Australia is that if the US and Europe go into simultaneous recessions, while we might like to tell ourselves that in the past 20 years that hasn't automatically meant a recession in Australia, the reason we've been able to avoid following the US and Europe into recessions when they've had them in the last 20 or so years has been because of the offsetting influence for us of very strong growth in China. And of course, China's economy has now got some significant problems of its own and is in no position to bail us out of a recession on the other side of the world if that's what happens. So what we've got to watch for here is not only the risks that the Reserve Bank might push rates up too high, which, as I say, I don't think is a 50-50 risk at the moment, but we've also got to watch the potential for adverse developments from overseas economies on us.
Thanks very much, Saul.
That's a pleasure. Good to talk to you as always.